You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Bart Wilson of Chapman University. Bart, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Thank you for having me.
So today we're going to start general, talking about experimental econ, and then we're going to go specific with one of Bart's papers that models early humans trying to scavenge for food. So Bart, let's start. Why should economists do experiments, and what do we get from experiments that's distinct from going and gathering data and then, say, running a regression or using some kind of econometric technique to look at the real world, or alternatively setting up a mathematical model and solving it? It's a relatively niche part of the field, but I think it's valuable. And what do you think is its main appeal?
Well, the history of it is that Vernon Smith was interested in exploring questions whether things actually happen the way he was taught they were. It's a way of taking the world as you think you understand it, building a model of it in the laboratory, and then putting it to the test, letting observation guide you in deciding whether or not what you thought the world worked that way, the world actually works that way. And so one of the benefits is that you can control a lot of variables that you can't do when you're going out to the field. You can add in exactly what you want, and you can take out what you want to take out. And that's one of the benefits of it, the kind of the power of it. And my own, the reason why I like it is I like going to the laboratory and finding out when I'm wrong. And that's really easy to do if you think you understand things and you build the model for the laboratory, and then that's not what the people do. And that, to me, is the beauty of experimental economics relative to some other ways of thinking about economics and studying it.
Right. So, yeah, economists were solving a lot of game theory type models where people perfectly predict how other people are going to make their choices, and they do that super well, and then you get this unique solution and you're like, aha, there's the Nash equilibrium. I'm certain that everyone is going to select that option. And I guess the first major breakthrough of experimental econ was to show that basically that's always false. Or there are a lot of game theory games where the solution you get by solving for a Nash equilibrium or iteratively deleting dominated strategies or using all sorts of math to find the solution is not the same thing that real people do in the lab. But it's also not approximately the thing they do. It's not like they just do what the math says, but with random error, correct?
Oh, right. The idea is that when you model the world, you're assuming things that you need to look for a solution. That assumption is not what our subjects necessarily take with them when they go to the laboratory. And that's their check on those assumptions that we're putting into our solution.
Yeah, and it's kind of strange how late in the game that economists started using experiments as tools. You do a lot of experiments, and you're there. I mean, I mentioned at the start, you're there at Chapman, which has sort of become a hub for experimental economists. Kind of worrisome that you seem to be poaching all the experimental economists in the world and putting them right on top of a fault line. But we hope for the best. So let's talk about this one recent paper of yours that I wanted to ask you about. It's called "Language and Cooperation in Hominin Scavenging," co-authored with Samuel Harris. And what's neat about it is it's looking at a scenario that we really couldn't go and get real world data on, and that is early humans, and kind of asking an evolutionary question about where our language comes from. So tell me about some of the motivation for that.
Well, about 13 years ago, when I got tenure, I got interested in exploring things that I wouldn't be able to explore before putting together a tenure packet. One of those was language. And so I was drawn to it by just the observation that language is about exchange and economics is about exchanging of things. Would there be some kind of insights I could get from studying language, and that might help me understand how people exchange things. And one of the authors, Derek Bickerton, was suggested to me by my associate dean at the time at George Mason University, who was a linguist. And she said, he's got some different ideas out there, some unorthodox ways of thinking about language. And so I started reading them. And he's a very good author. And one of his kind of more recent theses was that language started about 2 million years ago as a solution to solving a scavenging problem that our early ancestors were facing at the time. And what was interesting to me was that he made a comment in the book was Adam's tongue, how humans made language and language made humans. And he made a point that, well, this is obviously something that we can't collect explicit data on, but we could test some upper bounds of this hypothesis in an experiment. And I thought to myself, well, that's exactly what I do. Let's think about how we could test some of his notions using modern humans and putting them in an environment that would be modeled after what he was hypothesizing happened sometime between 1 and 2 million years ago.
Yeah, it has the trait of a lot of these studies that you put yourself in the shoes of the person participating in it, and you got to think that they've got to be pretty confused. I mean, it's computerized, and they, you drop their avatar into a sort of little African savanna kind of environment and say, "Hey, go scavenge for food." Tell me about what would I experience as a subject in this experiment?
Well, that's a very good way of describing it. You think of you want to be more geeky, the Star Trek reference. You kind of beam somebody onto a planet and say, "Now make do." And in this world, they are dropped into a digitized world where they are told they can go scavenging for berry, and they can scavenge for marrow, and they can pick it up, and here's how to do it. They're told, here's how you can move things to other people, and at night you need to go find a place in an oasis to hide, otherwise you're going to get beat up by some virtual predators out there. And that's basically all they're told. And what they're not told, and what they have to discover, and that the whole point of this type of experiment is to see what they discover and how they react to the world that they're facing, is that there's not enough berries and not enough marrow for all 9 avatars in the experiment to support themselves. And then the way they were instructed how to collect bone, marrow, and berries with the same clicking of the mouse then could be used if they travel further westward and come across something new. And that was the point of the experiment, be able to scavenge for meat that's just out there. And so the same way they collect berries and the same way they collect marrow is the way they could collect this meat. And the first time they happen upon it, that's exactly what they do. After the first occurrence, first time they come across it, then that's when the interesting part starts. We introduce a predator that's going to protect it. And then they have to figure out how they're going to get it when there is another actually digitized as a large cat protecting it. And so what they can discover is that if multiple people try to defend against that cat, and then they get less and less damage as they try to go get food. And the experiment is set up such that if you get 3 people defending against the tiger, and then 1 person going after the meat, no one gets hurt, and you collect the most that you can from it. And so they need to, without any instruction from us, the experimenters, find a way to get 3 people to go after the same piece of meat in a world that's very large, and they can travel all over the place. And the problem that Derek Bickerton argued that needed to be solved was that how to get people going in the same direction for the same aim, go after this way, go left, not right, go around the hill, go that way. And that sounds easier to us who have well-developed language and know the people that we deal with quite regularly. But think of it, how to solve that problem if you have disputes about, no, I think we should go that way. No, I think we should go the other way. And his argument is that this language would be a way to communicate outside the here and now about what to do and how to solve this problem. And the really interesting thing is that for him, the theory of cooperation comes in a sense for free. Once you solve this group problem of how do we get to this guarded piece of meat, once we get that, then there's plenty of food there for everyone once we got rid of the predator. And so this is modeled from the archaeological record in that, prior to 2 million years ago, you would see these dead carcasses with claw and fang marks on top underneath, and then you would see the markings of the stones trying to break open the bones to get the marrow inside. And then it switches. And so somehow these hominins are getting to the bones first, and then the predators are coming after them. So that implies that they were working together to fend off these predators, and that how you solve that problem is what he hypothesizes is the origins of language. And that is the same problem that the subjects had to solve.
Interesting. So it's based on archaeological evidence that shows early humans, because presumably early humans are the only ones using stone tools. Shows early humans at first getting to carcasses last after they've been picked clean by the other animals, and then later getting there first or getting there early enough that they get the prime meat.
Right.
Interesting. So yeah, that does seem like a difficult problem, because in the scavenging economy, you wouldn't naturally want to just follow someone else. There's no reason to really think about, if you go somewhere as a team, then one person might get all the marrow and berries, and the people following behind get nothing. So it makes more sense to spread out and go different directions in order to figure out that there's a way for teamwork to make you a better scavenger. It does seem like you need some communication.
Yes, and basically communication and an agreement that this is what we are going to do. Instead of having a bunch of eyes going around searching for things, you and I together are going to do this. And that what's interesting, and so is that, there are commonalities. Lots of animals hunt in packs. Chimpanzees go out as a group and hunt for monkeys, and lions hunt in prides. But it's not clear that they're working for a common benefit, but rather we're all working out there so that once we take something down, we're all going to grab as much as we can of it. And so Michael Tomasella makes the observation that that's group acting in, he calls it I mode, individual mode. But what is different about this would be that we're working in we mode, that we are all going out to get a benefit for all of us. Mm. And so if you look at lions, once they take down an animal, it's whoever can get the fastest. And same thing is with chimpanzees, whoever can hang on to the monkey gets to eat it. And so, but what's different here is that when you get this big carcass, these prehistoric, elephants, there's enough for everyone once you've kept away all your competing mammals. And that's the interesting part of this story of cooperation. It's not reciprocal in the same way. Someone has to defend while someone else collects the meat, with the understanding that in the future, I'm going to get some of that because I've done this part of the defense.
So a lion hunt is not an example of exchange, but a human scavenging and defending operation is a form of exchange. It takes a higher level of cooperation and some level of organization. So let's talk about how you were able to test this, how you varied the the treatments to sort of tell a story about what these people in the lab would do under different circumstances. What exactly did you vary from treatment to treatment?
Well, so our strategy was that we wanted to see what words were really important for the group to solve this problem. And so I worked on this project for 7 summers with Sam Harris, who was an undergraduate at the time at Johns Hopkins, and he would come out to Chapman every summer to work on this project. And our goal was to say, well, we're going to give you a bunch of words that you can use, and we want to shrink that set and to say, oh, here's when the point when cooperation doesn't work anymore. And so the first treatment was we allowed people to say whatever they wanted. So Sam spent the summer mining the data from those 6 sessions, getting a sense of here are the common words that were used when they were successful in forming a group and fending off the competitors, and what are the features of what were they not saying in the groups that were unsuccessful. And from that list, we put together a set of words of somewhere around 30 some characters that we thought were real important. And then, not knowing at that point we were going, exactly what we were going to take away, but the idea was we're going to gradually take away words and see where we cut off cooperation. As is true in most experiments, we were surprised and the world didn't quite work the way we thought it was going to work. And so, and that's kind of the lesson of experimental economics. But what we did first was allow people to use free-form language. And what was interesting is that there were several groups who never really got together to cooperate. And then there were some groups that were extremely good at it. And it was that kind of diversity from very bad to excellent that we then were able to say, well, look, here's a set of words that's very common in the successful ones, and that word is not in the other one. And so they would say, like, stay together to keep the group together. People didn't talk like that in the sessions where they weren't successful. And so then we put those words together, and then slowly we started taking sets away. And it turned out it was much harder to stamp out cooperation than we expected.
Okay, so I like what I like about this is the sort of iterative nature of it. Often, you have your hypothesis in advance, and then you decide exactly what you're going to do, and then you do it, and then you look at the data. But the neat thing about this is you didn't know going into the first treatment what the later treatments were going to be, what kind of things were going to end up being important and being worthy of testing. So it was more a sort of feeling around, not just for the answer, but for the right questions to ask.
Yes, and that is more and more how my experimentation has gravitated towards, kind of letting the subjects tell me where the interesting directions are to go. This experiment was very important for me in that kind of thinking of that, because I thought that this was the way to solve the problem, and then I was wrong. Treatment after treatment, I thought the words that you use to kind of come together and stay together, we thought, oh, those recruiting words, those are the ones that are going to be important. Follow me. If they can't say that, then they can't get a group together. Then we run that, we take away those words, and sure enough, they're still able to get a group together. And so we got a sense that the words weren't developed to fit the problem in the same way that kind of thought, this word, this concept, that's what's important. No, they have a task, and they're going to make do with what they can in order to, solve the problem at hand.
Yeah. One interesting thing in your paper is that you show a lot of the chat logs in free chat period 27. Brown says, when you're done, just switch over. And then Orange says, we should get the extra and then give it to you guys. And then Red says, get extra and share. So they're coordinating how they're going to get the meat and who's going to defend and who's going to grab, and whether they're going to take turns or one person's going to get all the meat and then share it. And you get a really interesting narrative of each of the sessions. That that's kind of absent from most research. The story of what happened.
Yes, this paper is a story about
Mhm.
stories. And that was part of the challenge, was to convince the reader that this was the interpretation, that our interpretation kind of followed this pattern that we saw, and that you might have other theories about it, but if you want the data, here are the data. You can go through it too. But things like certain words just really came up over and over and over. Phrase "stick together," "stick with others," "stuck together." Together was something that groups that were successful said over and over and over, and so that's why we thought that would be important to put that word in our small subset.
Yeah. So tell me about the gradual restriction of the language. So at first they could type anything, and then afterwards, was it that they just got a set of buttons with words on them, just and they could only say specific things?
Yes. So then right. So once we thought, okay, here are the keywords. Let's now make it possible. These are the only things you can say. So instead of free-form typing, here's a subset, click on the buttons of these words. We had some, they're not, you really couldn't form coherent sentences, really. I mean, there's a set of words we call recruiting words: follow, need, stay, together, help, move, that seem to come up regularly. The words for the task itself of collecting the meat, we called it harvesting and defending against the tiger, and switching, if you switch from harvesting to defending and vice versa. Meat itself was a word. And then we had a bunch of pointers and arrows so they could, in a sense, simulate their fingers or which direction they wanted to go. Some substantives like I, me, we, us, you, people, berries and marrow, yes, no, give, and then you could able to have a emoticon of smile or frown or a question mark, and that's it. And the big test then for us was, did we choose the right set of words? With these words, can they still solve this problem? And that was an open question for us. We didn't know. We might have been overly restrictive, and we got, I guess, lucky in the sense that we run with just this small set of words and symbols, and we replicated the same kind of dynamics we saw with free-form language. So that was the moment that we got excited, because now we know that this set is sufficient for people to solve the problem. We can start restricting words in subsequent treatments to see if now we can stamp out cooperation, make it so difficult that they can't solve the problem.
Right. So having found the sufficient conditions, you gradually restricted it further to try to find the necessary conditions. Do people need the word meat in order to scavenge for meat together? So let's talk about some of those smaller subsets. Which things did you try removing first?
Well, so if the problem is you got to get people all together to say, this is what we want to do, go after meat, because they can go after berries, they can go after marrow, and they can go, and this world is very large, they can go many different directions. We thought those recruiting words of follow, stay together, need, and things like that were the really important words. And so if you didn't have those, then they would never be a group. Then the whole thing would fall apart. And so those were the first set of words that we took away. And sure, those words are useful, but it turns out if you still want to get people to get together, you don't need to say explicitly stay together. You just do a lot of pointing, and you say meet and point in that direction. And other people realize, oh, the idea is you want me to go along with you to do this. So they don't need to say follow me or stay together. They're just pointing, and people follow the pointers. And so that was the first set that we restricted. And so then we thought, okay, well, then what is real important are these scavenging words that they're talking about: harvest and defending. And since those were the key words at the moment of the problem, once they're all together, if they can't talk about that, that's going to break things down. Mm-hmm. And what they do is they just substitute other words like meat in for harvest. They'll say meat question mark meat, you meat, and they understand then that meat means harvest. I don't need to use that word. I just use the word meat. Mm-hmm. And they say it over and over, and they'll say 3 meat, 1 meat, basically saying one person harvest, the other people defend. They used to say 3 defend, 1 harvest. Groups just switched out the word defend and harvest for meat. Everyone knows what they mean by that.
And to be clear, these are different groups of people.
Yeah, these are always different groups of people, brand new, who have never seen it before. And so it was interesting that they basically had the same problem. They just then used different words that reinterpreted in this context. Phrase like I meet, you meet, we meet it was something that came up. They basically say we are going to harvest and defend together. So if the scavenging words didn't go away, well then let's just take away the whole word meat. That's going to make things really hard. And sure enough, there's only one group that even started to get this band forming, but they were still able to get a group together right towards the end of the experiment. A group of 4 people, so the right number, and they couldn't use the word meat. So they switched to this kind of identity, like, who are we? And they would almost get into a cheer, like, you, me, we, us, we, us, people, us. And that was the way they communicated that to stay together as a group, this is what we do. And it was just as efficient as any other group who had a full use of language to solve the problem. So what was interesting for us is that we saw that identity started to take over to solve the problem of being a group. And that was something we didn't expect.
Were you ever able to completely quash the ability to come together and work together? So
just to show that maybe at this point we were thinking, well, maybe people really don't even need words to solve this problem. Humans are just that good at this problem, or we just haven't made the problem that tough. So I would say when they're successful, it's only 1 session or 1 or 2 out of 6 in each of these treatment conditions. But so we're like, okay, maybe we can always solve this problem. So the last treatment to really just see that, no, they do need to have some kind of language, was all they could do was point with arrows and then have a smiley face, a frowny face, and a question mark. And if they could solve it with that, well, then gesturing, in a sense, is all that's necessary. We don't need language. And sure enough, not one group ever got even close of being successful at solving that problem. They got really frustrated with each other, lots of unhappy faces. People will be pointing in directions, and then they will go off the other way. So they do need to have language to solve this problem, and gesturing was not enough. So that was important, because otherwise you could draw the conclusion that gesturing could solve this problem.
Yeah. So we found out that a sense of shared identity, being able to identify as a group and a team. Looking at some of the transcripts, there's one where teal says us, smiley face, and orange says we, and green says we, smiley face, us, smiley face, and then teal does 3 northwest arrows. So that's them saying like, hey, we're a team, and we're going to go off to the northwest where the meat is.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. So from this, do you let's tie it back to the original hypothesis of language as developing in order to help the scavenging problem. It seems like you only need some fairly rudimentary language to solve the problem, but you do need some. So would you say the hypothesis is supported by your test, or maybe it cuts against it a little bit?
What we've shown is that this kind of problem requires persuasion of other people to share this common end. And that supports the thesis, and that was at the heart of what the Bickerton was talking about. For him, it was this idea of how is it that we will come to share this end as a group, and that language is important for that. So I think that part is really borne out. We can't say that, what are the first words or what even they might be. But for him, it was the idea that symbolic thought, this thinking outside the here and now, was really needed to solve this, to get people to have the same priority. And that was clear here. Because it was a wide open world, people could have competing ideas of what they should be doing. One experiment, there's a big group, 8 people kind of moving around together, and then there's always this one voice that's like, should we go back and get berries? And that could be really debilitating if all of a sudden some other people kind of go along with that, and all of a sudden the group disintegrates. And so for him to identify the idea that language persuades people to stick together is important. Also, indirectly, this notion of having an identity, something that stands outside here and now. Who are we? We are the kind of people, phrase that came up when they could use the word meat people. That's who we are. We are meat people, not berry people, not bone marrow people. But that's a concept, that's an idea that you can only get across in language. You don't get that just by being in a group. It's a group of individuals who then have some collective notion of who they are as one. That's important, and I would argue in line with what Wittgenstein's hypothesis is about.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting sort of finding because maybe points to something fundamental about humans. And we spend a lot of time in the modern day defining our identities and our group identities, and so maybe that's really fundamental to human nature and to the roots of language, and this experiment kind of points at it.
And on contrary to the modern world, where we have this idea that seems like it's getting in the way, here it was very useful.
Oh yeah,
to solve the problem. If we are a group, then we can solve this, and that kind of a group earns a lot more money in the experiment than the groups that are all off on their own, barely making it through. So the identity serves a important feature here. And what was interesting is these are random strangers put together, and they're able to do that with rudimentary words, come together and form this band or tribe. That shows how easy it is for humans to do that.
Yeah. It So zooming out again, this is a very artificial environment. It's it's all computerized. It's undergraduates in a lab. So much of our research is undergraduates in a lab. And so how do you defend the story you're telling that it's similar enough to the thing you're trying to model that some element of being a modern person in a computer lab doesn't radically change the outcome somehow?
Well, it's more about how I think about the world and how Sam thinks about the world. And what we're trying to do is convince people how they might see the world a little bit differently. I mean, the way, the common model is built in economics to solve a social dilemma is that we assume that individuals are self-interested, and we ask the question, well, do groups cooperate, and by how much? And that's the way the whole problem is posed. And we're always looking at what treatment conditions are going to allow groups to be cooperation, and how much of the effect is there when they do that. Whereas, if you read about language, you think about human evolution and our origins, I see the world a little bit differently. The problem is, why is it that we have language? We use it to persuade people to work together for a common end. And that is our starting point in small groups. So then there's a new question you can ask. How is it that people persuade one another to cooperate with each other? That's just a different question. So for me, the idea of reading language and talking about something very different, I would have never thought about thinking in the world that way, never posed a problem that way, if I hadn't kind of looked outside economics.
Yeah.
And so the idea is that we're not claiming that we have, that Bickerton is right, that this is even evidence for him, except he posed a problem. We think, yeah, there's something to that problem. We see that same very problem to be overcome in this experiment. And now I'm thinking about, well, words do work. How is it that words do work to solve an economic problem? Mm-hmm. That's not something I started the project looking at, and it's something I now have a new appreciation for, going through this and being wrong treatment after treatment.
Yeah. It's really interesting that this is kind of an interdisciplinary project with anthropology. Most people would recognize this question or, the title of this paper and think would have been done by anthropologists. But economics, like in many areas, brings some new insights and new techniques that maybe others haven't found yet. Do you have any closing thoughts for the listeners, for anything that people should know if they're interested in this specific problem of language or in experimental econ more generally?
Well, if you're interested in language and the origins of language and in a somewhat unorthodox hypothesis, I certainly would recommend that you pick up some books by Derek Bickerton. He is a fantastic writer. If you pick him up and you want to read more than one book of his, you'll notice that he has changed his ideas about how language works over time. That's always refreshing for me when I read an author to say, I used to think about it this way, but now I'm wrong. I think it should be this way. That is something in general I've kind of picked up on reading about linguists. They tend to be quite forthright about admitting when they were wrong about things. So that's kind of fun and refreshing. And so I work with Vernon Smith. His advice to me is to read broadly and work narrowly. Reading broadly, for me in this case, involved reading evolutionary biology, reading evolutionary linguistics, and working narrowly is I build experiments. I know how to build virtual worlds. I know how to design the software so that it is usable as an interface for undergraduates. And I work very narrowly then on this type of a question. And that seems to me to be good advice for budding experimentalists.
My guest today has been Bart Wilson. Bart, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Thank you for having me. It was fun.
That concludes this week's episode of Economics Detective Radio. The discussion question for this week concerns something we talked about toward the end of the episode. That is the idea that identity was fundamental to being able to coordinate these groups in this experimental setting. So, question is, do you agree that the ability to form identity groups is a fundamental part of human nature that sets us apart from other animals and other apes? And if so, what conclusions might you draw from that, or what other hypotheses might that give rise to? If you want to answer that question and join the discussion, go to Economics Detective on Facebook. That's a closed group. You can request to join and join the discussion. I'll be back next week with a new episode.